Welcome to the SRE screencast on zoned routing, part 2, configuration walkthrough. Today we'll be taking a look at the web interface. We'll walk through all the different aspects of zoned routing configuration, and we'll be checking back with a route query periodically through the video so we can see the effects of the changes that we're making. First things first, let's go ahead and get logged in. Before we get into any configuration, I'm going to go ahead and populate the route query that we're going to be using throughout the video. This way we can get a baseline for what it looks like before we've made any changes to the system. And here's our baseline route query results. As you can see, we use the SPR customer, and we did receive the ANI and TLX vendors that all came from that network diagram in the first video. So we'll be following along with that customer and those two vendors throughout the rest of this video. I would like to point out the other new additions in support of the zoned routing feature. The first of which is the zoned routing status at the bottom of the feature status table. This will just simply alert you as to whether or not zoned routing was employed during the routing process. And the other additions are the home zone ID, routed zone ID, and IP routed to fields in the potential termination. And we will be going over those a little bit more as we progress through the configuration, and you can see what they're actually reporting. So let's go ahead and close that up. And next, let's go ahead and pull up the SPR endpoint and take a look at its configuration. First off, you can see we can't actually assign a home routing zone to this endpoint because we have not created any routing zones in the system yet, which I'm sure makes sense. Additionally, if we were to try to edit the zone IP assignments for our endpoint, we would not be able to because there are no routing zones configured in the system, as you can see plainly reported here. So let's go ahead and remedy that and create some routing zones. Just click routing zones in the main menu, create new routing zone, and off you go. I'm going to go ahead and create 3 routing zones. They will be based on the 3 POPs that were created in the network diagram of New York, Dallas, and Los Angeles. For the zone egress cost, I'm simply filling in numbers here just for the demonstration. However, in reality, that zone egress cost should reflect the cost of the transit network that we're trying to avoid. So in this case, it would be the cost of the bandwidth of sending the call out of the New York POP and across the transit network. So let's go ahead and check our route query and see if anything's changed. And probably not all that surprisingly, the query results have not changed in any way. As well, they shouldn't have. We're not actually using zoned routing yet. All we've done is created the zones in the system. So let's go ahead and close that up, and let's start making some configuration changes to start making use of zoned routing. So let's first pull up our customer trunk group. Now, under normal circumstances, the first thing that you should be doing is configuring the home routing zones on all of the endpoints so that the system can make the most intelligent decisions it can. However, I'm going to do things a little out of order, and I'm going to try to start using zoned routing before I've configured any routing zones, just to demonstrate what will happen. So I'm going to go into the SPR endpoint under the origination settings. I'm going to enable the Use Zoned Routing flag, and I'm going to save my configuration. Now let's see if there's any changes in our routing query. And we do have a change, but it's only a single change, and it's pretty obvious. As you can see, the giant red flag in the zoned routing status. And what that's telling you is that zoned routing was requested, meaning it was turned on for the originating trunk group. However, that trunk group does not have a home routing zone assigned, And without a home routing zone, there's no way for SRE to make any intelligent decisions about this group in relation to the routing zones or any of the other endpoints. So let's go ahead and close that up, and let's assign ourselves a home routing zone. If you recall from the video, the SPR customer was in New York, and you can see we still have the zone routing flag enabled. So we'll save that, and let's check out our route query. So we've got a couple of changes to go over here, the most obvious of which is the zone routing status. Our red flag has now changed to a yellow flag, and that's simply denoting the fact that zone routing was requested and used to route this call. In addition, it reports the zone egress cost associated with the originating endpoint's home zone. In this case, that home zone is New York, which you can also see reported in the originating endpoint table. And that home zone of New York has an egress cost of 0006 associated with it. And finally, the last change to note is in the status column of the potential termination table. Normally you would simply see an OK for a valid potential termination route, but you're seeing now an OK with the ZEC applied. Whenever SRE finds that an endpoint is outside of its home routing zone, by the way, SRE treats an unassigned routing zone as outside of its home routing zone, it goes ahead and applies the zone egress cost to that vendor's rates. So in our first route query, or in our baseline route query at the beginning of the video, the term rate was listed as 0012. Now you can, for ANI, now you can see it's listed as 0018, which is the effect of the zone egress cost. Let's go ahead and close that up, and let's configure the home routing zones for our two vendor groups. If you recall from the network diagram, ANI was in Los Angeles, and we configured TLX to be in Dallas. And let's see what our route query looks like now. As you can see, not a lot has changed. The only major changes really are the correct reporting of the home routing zone and routed zone IDs for the ANI and TLX endpoints, where we just set the home routing zones. So let's go ahead and close that up, and let's actually put zone routing to work for us. Now let's go ahead and pretend that we've talked to our TLX vendor, we've turned up a secondary trunk group in New York, and we're ready to start putting it to work for us. So we're going to go ahead and click on the routing zone IPs icon of the existing endpoint, and we're simply going to add that IP address as an alternate IP for the New York routing zone. The alternate IP assignment configuration is fairly straightforward. For any endpoint, you're simply presented with a list of all of the currently configured routing zones in the system, and you're given then the option to edit the IP address of the endpoint in that routing zone. As you can see, the home routing zone is already filled in for you, as it will simply use the base address of the endpoint. So let's go ahead and set an IP address in New York for our TLX endpoint. And save, and you can see the new address is now reported for the New York routing zone, so let's check out what the route query looks like. And now we can finally start to see the effects of zone routing. If you look in the potential termination table, you'll notice that TLX has moved up into the #1 slot. And the reason for that is that TLX is no longer having the zone egress cost applied to its rates, which you can see in the status box. It's simply listed as OK. The reason no zone egress cost is being applied is because there was an alternate IP address inside the home routing zone of the originating endpoint, in this case New York, that we were able to route the call to, rather than having to leave our routing zone in New York and send the call to the Dallas routing zone where TLX is. Now, because that zone egress cost was not applied to TLX's rates, but it was applied to ANIs, you can see it's caused a shift in the order of the vendors. Even though TLX technically has a more expensive rate, the overall call is cheaper by avoiding the use of the transport network. This, in a nutshell, is what zoned routing was intended for. So let's go ahead and close that up, and let's go ahead now and add a New York zone IP to our ANI vendor. And just click the routing zone IPs icon, edit New York's address, and simply add the new IP there. Now this is assuming that we've turned up a new ANI trunk group out of New York. And let's look at the route query now. Again, not a lot of change from what we've been looking at previously, but you can see that ANI has now moved back into the number 1 slot for exactly the same reason that TLX did previously. By creating an alternate zone IP in the New York routing zone, we avoid the use of the transit network, and because of that, we do not have to apply the zone egress cost, and in so doing, ANI is back to its original rate of 0012. And we'll go ahead and close that up. Now let's pretend that the zone routing has been a rousing success and we're just blowing up that internet connection in New York. So all you simply need to do to disable this feature is to go into that origination endpoint, disable your Use Zone Routing flag, save that configuration, and voila. All of your routing has now been reverted back to the way it worked without zone routing. It's just that easy. And with that, there's one final feature I'd like to go over, and that is going to be enabling and disabling specific zone IPs. So let's go ahead and get zone routing turned back on for our SPR group. Now this time we're going to go into the ANI routing zone IPs. Let's say that for whatever reason we want to stop sending them traffic over that New York IP. We'll simply go ahead and disable that, save that configuration. You can see it's become disabled, and when we check our routing query, we can see that in fact the routing has fallen back to the Los Angeles endpoint. Ultimately, this gives you the control to be able to open and close any of the various conduits an endpoint has to get to a specific vendor. I should also mention that you can disable the home routing zone IP address only and let just the alternate routing zone IPs be used for routing. That concludes our zone routing walkthrough. Thanks for watching this SRE screencast. If you have any questions or comments, my email address is on the screen.